Philosophy is the science of thinking, or maybe more accurately, it is the thinking of science. Philosophy is the idea of using logic and reason to draw conclusions about the world we live in, who we are, and perhaps even what our purpose here could be. The point is, philosophy is extremely versatile and can be applied to basically anything, including religion. Today we're going to look at two philosophers who used philosophy on religion, although they had slightly different end results. David Hume was a philosopher who rejected religious arguments using logic. Meanwhile, Anselm of Canterbury was a philosopher who used religion to create a logical argument that required God to exist. These two methods seem to contradict each other, so what's going on here? Well, today we're going to look at these two thinkers' positions, what they actually say. We're going to see which one is more correct, if any, and we're going to see what this story tells us about logic and religion. Hi, my name is Jack, and yes, this is for a school project, and no, I don't care, it's still going up on the main channel. Welcome to a new series that I may or may not call Philosophy in the Closet. Enjoy. Okay. David Hume, although never openly an atheist, was a staunch and vocal critic of many Christian apologetic strategies in 18th century England, a time and place where these ideas could get you killed, although for him it cost him his job and prevented much of his work from being published until after his death. Hume believed that God's existence could not be proven using logic, and that instead, logic was the best tool for dismantling many religious arguments. The first of which that we will discuss is the imaginary watchmaker, that claims that nature's complexity resembles intelligent creation, and thus must have been intelligently created. For example, the human eye resembles a modern-day camera, and so you don't find modern-day cameras sprouting out in the woods, you have to create them. And people applied this logic to all sorts of natural structures. Hume points out that there is no evidence for these structures to be anything but natural. And additionally, even if there was evidence to say that these structures were intelligently created, who's to say that it was the Christian God? Who's to say that it wasn't a bunch of minor gods, or even that it wasn't gods at all, and that it was something like aliens? There's no proof that these things are anything but natural, and there's definitely no proof that it is the Christian God's handiwork. Hume's second argument sought to disprove the existence of miracles. And this proved to be a lot simpler, since there is no evidence supporting miracles at all. He evoked an idea that was similar to Occam's razor, which claims that the simplest solution is often the most likely. For instance, what is more likely, that your aunt really did see somebody rise from the dead, or that your aunt is lying, or misremembering, or high? Miracles are extraordinary, and thus require extraordinary evidence. Anselm was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, whose philosophical work focused on combining philosophy with Catholic Christianity. This may seem impossible since Christianity, and any other religion, is based on faith, while philosophy is based on logic. Anselm attempted to rectify this using an argument that he called the ontological argument, which I'm about to explain, but bear with me, it's a little hard to follow. Anselm claimed that since God is the most perfect thing we can imagine, and God exists in our imagination, then a real God must exist, since a real God would be greater than an imaginary God. Anselm further defended this argument by saying that this ontological argument only worked on God since he is the most perfect thing of all things. Now that we understand Hume and Anselm's positions, imagine these two in a room together discussing whether or not we can prove God's existence using logic. Anselm begins, since the burden of proof lies on Christianity, by outlining his ontological argument, which we discussed earlier. Hume might begin his rebuttal by agreeing with Anselm's ontological argument's premise, but disagreeing with its conclusion. It does logically follow that the most perfect thing would exist in reality rather than exist in our imagination, but there is no reason to assign that the character of God, let alone the Christian God. The title of God was arbitrarily assigned by Anselm to the most perfect thing. All Anselm did was prove that the most perfect thing would be more perfect in reality rather than simply in our imaginations. It is difficult to think about how Anselm might react to this criticism, but we can use his faith to speculate. For example, Anselm believes that God is real as a fact, and he builds his logical arguments to reach this conclusion, rather than following natural logical arguments and seeing if they lead to God. On the other hand, Hume was never openly Christian or atheist, so we do not know what biases he may have had. However, looking purely at these two men's logical arguments and at Hume's tendency to choose the most likely solution, it is clear that this habit diminishes his bias more than Anselm's. For this reason, and again purely for the logical argument that these men outline, in my book, David Hume is the winner of this argument. So what can this discussion tell us about logic and religion? It showcases that you cannot use one to disprove the other. Firstly, you cannot use your previously existing religious beliefs and then create a convincing logical argument, as we saw from our theoretical debate. Secondly, you cannot use logic to completely prove or disprove religious claims. For instance, even if Hume spent his whole life disproving Christian apologetics, that would not disprove the idea of God, or the idea that God exists. Ganilo of Marmoutier, a contemporary of Anselm, knew this, and he even stated that religious belief should never be based on logic alone. We have seen David Hume's skeptical, logical approach used to disprove Anselm's stained glass-tainted logic behind his ontological argument, which has shown us that religion has its bias and that logic has its limitations. It's easy to think about these two great thinkers sitting in a room smoking cigars, talking about divinity and logic as something that we could only read about. But I encourage you to have these discussions of similar topics with your friends and peers. The spirit of philosophy is free discussion on complicated topics. As my good friend Peyton always says, talking's like thinking with your mouth. So get out there and start mouth thinking. I like that. Nature's complexity resembles intelligently. I'm gonna break my wrist on the floor.